Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Be Like Christ, our 5-minute Bible study series. I should say more like 10 minutes. It was like 10 minutes yesterday. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to be faster today. Let's talk about 1 Kings chapter 7. And there's so much in this chapter that we have to be fast if we're going to not repeat yesterday's sin of 5 extra minutes of time. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 7, there is a free PDF on our website, as you probably know. When did these events happen? 1 Kings chapter 7 discusses events that happened in the early to middle years of Solomon's reign, which would have been from about 1015 to 975 BC. Our key characters for this chapter, first we've got Solomon. He's the third king of Israel and Judah. And then we've got Hiram the metal worker. This is kind of confusing because we already talked about a guy named Hiram. He was the king of Tyre. This is a different Hiram than that Hiram. This guy was from the tribe of Naphtali, and he was skilled in bronze work. And then over to our map, Jerusalem's where this temple is being built that we talked about in the last chapter. We're going to talk about it again today. We're also going to talk about 2 new locations by the Jordan River. Hiram cast the bronze for the temple in the plain of Jordan, quote, in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. Our outline is so long today that we don't have an application section, although I will include somewhat of an application at the end talking about a significant location that is key to this chapter. So let's get into this. Verses 1 through 12, Solomon's house is built. Just for your reference, if you've forgotten, a cubit, which is the primary unit of measure that we're going to be discussing, is about 18 inches or 46 centimeters. Solomon spent 13 years building a house for himself. The house was made from trees from the forest of Lebanon, which was like this legendary forest where, these incredible trees and this incredible wood came from. Solomon built several other houses, you might say, which may have been adjoining structures. The house of the forest of Lebanon, so I think that was the name of this building, the house of the forest of Lebanon was 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and it had 45 cedar pillars in it. And it was cedar that was the famous wood that was coming from these forests. The Hall of Pillars was another location, another building. It was 50 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. And then finally, the Hall of the Throne, or the Hall of Judgments, was where Solomon naturally pronounced his judgments. The text also tells us that he built a house for his wife, the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt. And these houses were constructed with costly materials and huge stones. Solomon was very, very rich. He didn't skimp on these buildings. Section number 2, verses 13 through 22, the bronze pillars at the temple. If you want to get a visual of this, I'm going to refer you back again to the temple diagram from the ESV, which I have linked down below. It does a lot better job than any kind of diagram that I could put together on these. So the bronze pillars at the temple. Solomon brought this guy named Hiram, this metal worker, a man from Naphtali, to Jerusalem to do bronze work at the temple. He made 2 pillars of bronze, and these things were pretty large, 18 cubits tall and 5.7 cubits wide. They were each topped with a capital, or kind of like a cap, of 5 additional cubits. One pillar was set on the south side of the vestibule, and the other one was set on the north. And these were such momentous structures that they were given names. Jachin on the south, that was the name of the southern pillar, and then Boaz on the north. Boaz, you remember that name? That was the name of the man who married Ruth way back in the book of Ruth. Now we need to talk about the great metal sea, like a body of water, verses 23 through 26. Hiram cast a huge metal bowl which held so much water that it was called a sea. And this water was for the priests to wash themselves before they served in the temple. The huge bowl was 10 cubits from brim to brim, so that's like 15 feet across. 10 cubits from brim to brim and 5 cubits deep. So a priest probably could have dunked themselves they definitely could have dunked themselves in this water. It held 2,000 baths of water. That would be approximately 12,000 gallons or 44,000 liters. As its platform, it was placed on the backs of 12 metal oxen, 3 pointing in each of the cardinal directions. So that might be hard to visualize, but again, that diagram from the ESV really does a pretty good job. There were other vessels, other basins that held water at the temple, and that's the topic of the next section, verses 27 through 39. The 10 bronze basins and their rolling stands. So Hiram made 10 rolling stands which held 10 basins of water. They're described in quite a lot of detail. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits tall. A basin was set on each stand. The basin measured 4 cubits and it held 40 baths of water. So these were significantly smaller. That's about 240 gallons, which is still quite a bit, or 880 liters. And these had wheels on the bottom of them so they could be moved around. Hiram put 5 stands and basins at the temple's north side, and then 5 stands and basins on the south side. These stands and the basins were used by the priests for the sacrificial offerings. All right, now let's finish off our 51 verses with verses 40 through 51, the golden furnishings at the temple. So the first part of this last section gives us just a summary of all the stuff that Hiram did. And I definitely encourage you to read this chapter because there's even more that I haven't been able to mention. It records a few things in addition to what we talked about that were made for the temple, including bronze pots, shovels, and vessels. The last few verses tell us about Solomon making the golden furniture, which was actually going to be designated for the interior of the temple. There's no better way to summarize this than just to read verses 48 through 50, so we'll conclude with this. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, before the inner sanctuary. The flowers, the lamps, the tongs of gold, and the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple. And so there you have it, chapter 7, quite a detailed list of more of these items that were designed and created around and to go inside of the temple. Now for our application, this is definitely a different one today, but if you've ever seen, or if you've ever read the Bible, you hear the forests of Lebanon and the cedars of Lebanon referenced quite often, and they actually appear in other ancient texts as well. This was basically like a legendary forest. The wood was incredible. Cedar is quite a useful wood, and you might have the question, well, where did that go? Does that still exist? Are there still forests in Lebanon? If you look at the Lebanese flag, it actually has a tree right in the middle, and that's a cedar tree. Unfortunately, though, these trees and the forest that used to exist there really doesn't exist in the same capacity, I guess, as it used to. It was used up by, Solomon. It was used by the Egyptians. I guess they used cedar resin to embalm people. And then also the Phoenicians, who were seagoing merchants, they cut down those trees to build their ships. It was also used as early as, or as late as, like World War I, and also during the time of the Ottoman Empire. They cut down those trees to build railroads. There are a few trees remaining in that area, and they've been designated as like a World Heritage Site. They're now protected. The place is called the Cedars of the Gods, but it's nothing like it used to be in its former glory. So for the application today, a little bit of a history lesson. That's what happened to the forests of Lebanon.